Hi, I'm Gary Ford from Tiger Hobbies Limited. Welcome to part 2 of the Spitfire at 90, the Spitfire Mark V and the summer of the Focke-Wulf. Back in late 1917 and early 1918, decisions made by the Royal Flying Corps and the early RAF under Trenchard and other commanders would possibly seal the fate of the Spitfire Mark V over France in 1941-42 in the infamous Fighter Sweeps. Let me explain a little. After Bloody April in 1917, the Royal Flying Corps and later RAF would be equipped with better fighters in the Sopwith Camel, SE-5A, plus Trenchard's Independent Air Force with its massive Adley Page bombers, and the doctrine of always go on the offensive. This doctrine would be taught at Royal Air Force College Cranwell during the 1920s and 30s to young officer cadets, and young officers in service with the RFC and RAF in the Great War would carry this doctrine to World War II as senior officers. The Battle of Britain was perhaps the most glorious episode in Royal Air Force history, but the architects of this victory, C&C Fighter Command, Hugh Dowding, and 11 Group Commander Keith Park, would be sidelined in favour of more aggressive commanders. Arguments about the tactics of the Battle of Britain, small effective groups hitting the Luftwaffe, or large wings known as the Big Wing Theory, by 12 Group Commander Lee Mallory, would rattle about in the high command of the Royal Air Force. As a result, Air Chief Marshal Sholto Douglas became the new C&C Fighter Command. Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory would take over 11 Group in December 1940. They would then leave Fighter Command into the infamous Fighter Sweeps of 1941-42, carrying out the doctrine of always go on the offensive. The trouble was the Royal Air Force was just not ready and would face exactly what the Germans had faced when they flew over Britain. Strong defence, poor range of the fighters with little thought of tactics. The submarine Spitfire during the summer of 1940 had kind of ruled the skies, being least the equal of the Messerschmitt Bf-109E. But better versions of the 109 were coming online, and the problems of the early Spitfires, though had been kind of sorted out with the Mark II, still left an interceptor aircraft unsuited for the offensive role. New, heavier and faster aircraft, such as the Hawker Typhoon, would not be ready for a good while, and the Royal Air Force were losing interest in the revolutionary Westland Whirlwind, which was more of an offensive aircraft with massive firepower in its nose and a longer range. In late 1940, the RAF would go on the offensive with two tactics: rhubarb, with small groups of fighters looking for trouble, and larger circuses, with larger number of fighters on clear days escorting light bombers. Rhubarbs would start in late 1940, and the first circus would run from January 41. In the background, work on improved versions of the Spitfire were starting with the Mark III, that in development terms had everything in the kitchen sink chucked at it, but it was struggling in development, so a compromise aircraft would be needed. This would be the Spitfire Mark V, or V in Roman numerals, adapted from the Mark I, Mark II airframe. About 100 Spitfire A's or VAs were produced, including aircraft that would have flown by Douglas Bader, as he preferred the machine gun version of the Spitfire, not the cannon arm version. But the rest of the 6,500 would be produced as Spitfire Mark V B and C models. The Spitfire V would be equipped with the Merlin 45. It also had a larger oil cooler, slightly stronger undercarriage that was splayed ever so slightly forward to take the weight of a slightly heavier engine. The Merlin 5 could also cope with higher combat boost settings for much more of the time, and also add over 300 to 400 brake horsepower over the earlier Spitfire, plus it could reach at least another 3,000 to 4,000 foot of altitude, and with about 30 mile an hour at the top end, so top speed of about 380 mile an hour. But like all Spitfires at the time, it still had a carburettor controlling its fuel intake into the engine, unlike the GTIs of the Luftwaffe. This resulted in lower acceleration speeds, which would cause massive problems to the Royal Air Force. Entering Royal Air Force service with 92 Squadron in February 1941, it soon entered combat over France with the Messerschmitt 109E and later F models, which it met by April 1941. The Spitfire V were more than adequate in coping with both these aircraft, but pilots were lost or basically run out of fuel or bounced by German fighters at lower speed while transiting over to France, or in some cases actually the combat area. During the Battle of Britain, engine or fuel management was not really a problem while fighting over the UK. Pilots set their combat power to whatever they needed, and if you started to run out of fuel, well, you broke off, landed and got more fuel. The Luftwaffe was suffering with as little as 10 minutes over London with the 109E. When the Royal Air Force went on the attack, it faced exactly the same problems. But engine management or fuel management and combat power setting briefs were not looked at for at least 18 months. Fuel capacity for the Spitfire Mark V was 85 gallons in 2 tanks just forward of the pilot. And at full combat power of 16 pounds boost, 3,000 revolutions, you were burning 150 gallons per hour. Well, that's not much more than 30 minutes before you run dry. On the other hand, doing about 2,000 rev, setting 2 pounds boost, your burn rate was down to just 29 gallons per hour, but only doing sub 200 mile an hour. And if you were bounced by enemy aircraft at that speed, your Spitfire V could take at least 2 minutes to accelerate to combat speeds. And that's a long, long time in air-to-air combat. Just like the Battle of Britain, where Squadron was still flying Victory V formation or Vic formations, others were flying Finger 4s unofficially, learnt from the Luftwaffe. It's same with fuel management. Not all squadrons carry out. Some did, some didn't. But losses were mounting, and some of it could be down to this lack of briefing. During this period, many experienced Royal Air Force aces, many Battle of Britain veterans, were lost on fighter sweeps, including Douglas Bader in August 41, and in the same month, top-scoring Battle of Britain ace Eric Locke, along with 300 other pilots during that summer of 1941, and that's just against the Messerschmitt 109. The Battle of Britain went on from July 1940 to October 40, around about 4 months, but the fighter sweeps would last 18 months to the end of the summer or late summer 1942. And while this was happening, Britain was losing the war overseas, or certainly getting a hard time. They lost Greece and Crete. Rommel was chasing the 8th Army across North Africa and took Tobruk, rattling the door of Cairo and the Suez Canal. And from late 1941 into early 1942, the British were totally mantled by the Japanese in the Pacific and Far East. Fighter pilots in those theatres were flying early versions of the Hurricane, early versions of the P-40, and of course the Brewster Buffalo. No Spitfire would reach the Med until June of 1942 and October 1942 in North African numbers. And not until March of 1944 would the Royal Air Force get the Spitfire Mark VIII to India and Burma to replace its Hurricanes as its prime day fighter. Yet in this period, hundreds and hundreds of Spitfires, Hurricanes, light bombers and valuable aircrew would be lost for no strategic gain on fighter sweeps. In August of 1941, the very first reports of a new radial engine enemy aircraft started to appear. Initially, they were dismissed by Royal Air Force authorities and intelligence as captured Curtiss P-36 Hawks, but soon there was no denying the presence of the Focke-Wulf 190. The 190's performance was in fact kind of similar to Spitfire V, but it was faster at lower levels, its roll rate was far superior, and its acceleration and climb rate was better. But over 20,000 feet, where the Spitfire V was optimised, the difference between the aircraft was a lot closer, and of course, Spitfire had much better turning circle in air-to-air combat. The FW190 may have appeared in the late summer of 1941, but not in numbers. That would not happen until 1942. It takes time to convert pilots and build up a force in numbers, but by summer of 1942, the 190 was in service in France in huge numbers, with Jägergeschwader 2 and Jägergeschwader 26. These two units alone fielded some 200 machines online at any time. Just like the Spitfire against the 109 in the Battle of Britain, the FW190 on the defence picked and chose its fight. The RAF was sending in huge numbers of aircraft, especially Spitfires. That one German quote was, "We don't need radar, we can just hear them and see them." The FW190 would pick at the straddlers or harass the RAF fighter wings at the sides. Then, as they turned back, and Royal Air Force pilots had one eye on their fuel gauges, masses of 190s would pounce. I will cover 3 incidents during the summer of 1942. Just as the RFC had the Fokker scourge in 1915 and Bloody April in 1917, Fighter Command had the summer of the Focke-Wulf in the summer of 1942. The first incident we'll look at is the Debden wing debacle on the 1st of June 1942. In early June 1942, the Debden wing, consisting of 71 Eagle Squadron, the first Eagle Squadron by the way, Treble 1 Squadron, 350 Squadron and 65 Squadrons, were tasked to provide backup support to the Hornchurch and Biggin Hill wings that were covering a hurricane strike package attacking Bruges in Belgium in Circus 178. It just goes to show just how many of these operations the Royal Air Force were putting out during that period. A large force of 190s from JG-26 watched and waited as the massive force of Spitfires and Hurricanes approached the Belgian coast. The FW190s did not attack. They just let the Royal Air Force get on with what they were doing. As the force started to turn away, the FW190s pounced. After a small group of FWs drew away Treble 1 Squadron, a large force of about 50 Spitfires were then involved in a massive dogfight as they were running low on fuel and trying to get back home. The Debden wing fought well and actually accounted for a number of FW190s, but they were totally mauled, losing 20% of their force shot down and a number of others in the drink without fuel. Royal Air Force rescue launchers were very busy that day in the Channel and the North Sea. The next incident we'll look at is the incident with 403 Squadron just 24 hours later. In this case, it's even worse. 403 Squadron were led by famous Royal Air Force personality at the time, Squadron leader Al Deer, a New Zealander. They would meet a similar fate just one day later on the 2nd of June 1942. Leading 12 aircraft of 403 Squadron in blue, red and yellow sections on the second sweep of the day. First one, early morning sweep, was fairly uneventful, but the second one, after a late breakfast, would be horrible. Part of a larger formation of the North Wheeled Wing, with 222 Squadron and 331 Squadrons, led by Wing Commander Maldron, with other units on the sweep. On the way to the target, intelligence found the Luftwaffe waiting for them with mass numbers. It was decided, due to the Debden debacle the day before, to call it off. Wing Commander Maldron sent out a message on the RT in plain language. Withdraw now. Turn for home now. Do not hang around. Squadron leader Deer either did not get this message or simply may have ignored it. He was fairly fresh back to operational flying and may have wanted to get a bit of action. He would not be disappointed. 403 Squadron were left on their own, with masses of FW190s bearing down on them from a higher position. What happened next was the stuff of nightmares for a squadron, with individual pilots having to cope with 2-to-1, 3-to-1, even 4-to-1, an impossible situation, with butcher birds coming at them from all sides. This action would leave 6 pilots lost as prisoner of war, and 8 aircraft lost total, including aircraft damaged beyond repair getting back to base. I will list the pilots of 403 Squadron that day and their section commanders. So, Squadron leader Deer, leading red section, returned to base damaged. Flight Lieutenant Darling, leading blue section, returned to base, his aircraft damaged beyond repair. Flight Lieutenant Walker, leading yellow section, returned to base, badly damaged. The pilots of the squadron: Warrant Officer Campbell, shot down, prisoner of war. Sergeant Murphy, returned to base, damaged. Pilot Officer Gardiner, returned to base, damaged after a diversion. Flying Officer Parr, shot down, prisoner of war. Sergeant Hurst, shot down, prisoner of war. Pilot Officer Somers, shot down, prisoner of war. Flight Sergeant Aitken, shot down, rescued by the Royal Air Force. They thought he was a prisoner of war, but he got rescued by the RAF. Pilot Officer Wozniak, returned to base, aircraft damaged beyond repair. And finally, Sergeant Hunt, shot down prisoner of war. I think Sergeant Hurst, it was his very first mission. I'm now going to cover the largest one-day dogfight in Royal Air Force history, that of the combat over the Dieppe raid, 19th of August 1942. What happened to the Debden wing and the 403 Squadron would happen many more times over that summer of the Focke-Wulf in 1942. But the Spitfire V could and did hold its own, but poor Royal Air Force tactics and poor briefings about fuel management and combat power settings led to many unnecessary losses of Spitfire Vs from early 1941 to the late summer of 1942. Three things went in the RAF's favour though in the summer of 42, while it was getting a bit of a pasting from the old butcher bird. First, on the 1st of June, in June 1942, a Luftwaffe pilot landed a brand new FW190 in Pembrey in Wales by mistake. What a slice of luck for the Royal Air Force that was. In July 1942, saw the arrival of the incredible Spitfire Mark V, though in lower numbers. And 3, the arriving numbers about this time of the United States Army Air Force. In August 1942, combined operations led by Mountbatten would mount a massive raid on the French port of Dieppe as a trial for future landings. Now what they were looking for is to see if they could capture a port. This would consist of a full brigade of Canadian infantry, supported by Churchill tanks, a large force of commandos, plus US Army Rangers operating on the flanks. It would also be the opportunity for Fighter Command, Douglas and Lee Mallory to put up a massive force of Royal Air Force fighters supporting light and tactical bombers from 2 Group Bomber Command to support the landings, and hopefully force the Luftwaffe into air in what would be the largest one-day dogfight in Royal Air Force history. The landings went, as you say, Pete Tong. It was a total disaster. 3,000 Canadians were either killed or captured. Most of the tanks couldn't either get off the landing craft tanks, LCTs, and certainly not off the beach. I think just 1 or 2 did, but were quickly knocked out. The Pebble Beach and the icy wall was not ideal. And the massive lesson was, 2 massive lessons. 1, don't try to capture a port on future landings. Take your own. Hence the development of Mulberry for D-Day. And the other one, the requirement for total air superiority over the landing areas. For the Royal Air Force, its force was massive. 42 squadrons of Spitfire Mark Vs alone, plus a small number of the new Spitfire Mark IX, plus Hawker Hurricanes, Hawker Typhoons, early Mustangs, Allison-powered of course, Bostons and Blenheims. In fact, the Allison-powered Mustangs that the Royal Air Force used were incredible fast aircraft, but under 12,000 feet, and they were not really properly used. The RAF used them for low-level tactical reconnaissance. But the RAF had 100% air superiority over the landing areas, a massive lesson for D-Day as stated. So the Canadians generally were not touched by the Luftwaffe. But on the outskirts of the landing area, massive dogfights would take place from dawn until dusk, with reports of hundreds of Luftwaffe aircraft shot down, but that number was probably no more than 60. The Royal Air Force, though, lost over 100. The landings were a disaster, but air cover was spot on, and the Luftwaffe actually were in total shock just how many Royal Air Force aircraft were in action that day. I think this period of the late summer of 1942 is where the British military were kind of at its most powerful, as the Americans had not yet entered the fray in large numbers. So by the late summer of 1942, saw the end of what was known as the Fighter Sweeps. Overall, a total waste of time as far as strategic requirement goes, and this has been debated ever since by modern historians. But valuable lessons were learnt. Also, in 1942, the Air Ministry issued documents to all Spitfire Mark V and Mark IX squadrons about fuel management and combat power settings. Well, let's lock the barn because the horses were buggered off. So a typical squadron brief may look like this. Squadron takeoff, climb to a certain altitude, set boost and revolutions to keep fuel consumption as low as possible but keep a reasonable speed. As soon as we enter enemy radar cover, speed must be increased to at least 280 miles an hour, even if we are burning a little bit more fuel. And if there's any indication of enemy aircraft, your Spitfire V will accelerate to combat speeds far quicker than if we are dawdling around at less than 200 miles an hour to save a few gallons of petrol. The Spitfire V would take lessons from the capture of the FW190, resulting in the Spitfire Mark V CLF. LF stands for low level fighter. This was optimised for the low level with a more powerful version of the Merlin 50, clip wings, they mucked around with the impellers on the turbos, and that gave much better speed and acceleration at the lower level. This left the Spitfire Mark IX to deal with the FW190 and the 109 at altitude. Flight Lieutenant Glazer and Royal Air Force pilot at the time summed up the Spitfire V CLF. This was my very, very favourite Spitfire. During low-level escorts under 12,000 feet, I loved it. Its roll rate was excellent, its acceleration and speed excellent, and I had no problem encountering the FW190 at all. The Spitfire V would continue to serve until the rest of the war in Europe, especially the VCLF variant, while others will continue as advanced fighter trainers. Overseas in the Mediterranean, aces like George Burling in Spitfire VC Trops would give the Luftwaffe an hard time over Malta. Pilots like Neville Duke in the Spitfire VC Trops would dominate the Luftwaffe in the later North African campaigns. A lot's been stated about the Spitfire V, most of it uninformed. Many from Luftwaffe lovers today wearing their FW190 Butcherbird underpants. But some of it came from Royal Air Force commanders at the time, in the fine World War II British tradition of blaming your equipment and not looking at the mirror at your tactics and strategic picture. And you couldn't simply be asked to tell your young pilots how to conserve fuel and set combat settings. I will leave the last word to a scruffy pilot officer called Pilot Officer Prune of the World War II Flight Safety magazine. Now, Pilot Officer Prune was an invented character by the Royal Air Force. Pilot Officer Prune made every basic flying error and flight safety error you could think of. But more Royal Air Force pilots and aircrew owed their life to reading Pilot Officer Prune. So here's some of his quotes from the period at the end of the fighter sweep. 1. Don't loiter. If you cannot keep up, pull your bloody finger out. 2. Low revs and high boost will bring you back to roost. 3. Do not wait and see the Hun to open up the power on your kite. 4. If you want to live at the other side, get a move on. If you want to come back, save your petrol. 5. When briefed by your flight and squadron commanders before a mission, always ask, in fact insist, on knowing what revolutions and booster set at what time during the mission. So, the last few minutes of the episode, I'm going to have a look at some of the models on the table. Now, I will be doing another video where I'm going to talk about the models in detail, but if you've noticed from the Spitfire 90 Part 1, I've changed the actual model setup to feature aircraft that would have been featured during these fighter sweeps. Also, I've always admitted I'm not an historian, I'm here to sell models, but I'm a 66-year-old gentleman who's been reading about Royal Air Force history and military history since the late 60s and early 70s, when my father bought me Purnell's History of the Second World War, and I watched the old London Weekend Television's The World at War. Ever since then, I've been reading everything I can on military history, and obviously lots about the Royal Air Force. I've been serving the Royal Air Force myself for some 26 years within the supply trade. So I was quite familiar with Pilot Officer Prune. I used to read a magazine called Air Clues, and I used to read all the story. Well, the aircrew were allowed to write in anonymously, even in modern Royal Air Force times, telling of their mistakes so others could learn. Very, very important. Flight safety is the responsibility of everybody in the Royal Air Force, not just pilots. So on the display, you'll see a couple of books. One is Spitfire, A Complete Fighting History by Alfred Price. Now, Alfred Price wrote two books in the 70s. One was called Spitfire at War 1 and obviously Spitfire at War 2. Then in the early 90s, they combined these books, published by Ian Allen. I think they do locomotive books, but this massive book I've had now for over well, 36 years nearly. And it's my go-to Bible for Spitfire fighting and the history around that. And some of the tables I've quoted from, like the fuel management power boost settings I've got from that book. The other book on the side was produced in 2001. Last, putting the Spitfire Mark V into better perspective by Peter Kegel. Again, RAF Operation Northwest Europe. Again, both these books are slightly tatty because I've read them and read them again. So let's have a look at some of the models. First, we'll start with the die-cast models, which are down on the front. So on the turntable, I've got a couple really good value 1/72nd scale die-cast model by Panzerkampf Legion. One, a Spitfire Mark V, RFD Donald Duck, flown by Polish air ace Jan Zumbach. And on the deck, on its wheels, is the famous 190 Butcherbird. Now, both these aircraft have got wheels up, wheels down option, pilots in, pilots out, underwing stores where applicable. They're normally $29.99, but we do them for $24.99 each. And if you spend over £30, it's free shipping. And use the YouTube code YT10 to get another 10% off. These are excellent value for money models and great to start your aviation collection with. The other two die-cast models just to the left and right. To the right is, again, it's my very, very favourite Spitfire, and I've run this by Hobbymaster a few times. This is RFD Donald Duck. To the left is a Spitfire Mark VC Trop. We do a couple of VC Trops. We do one flown by the Malta ace George Burling, Falcon Malta. This one's by another famous desert ace for the Royal Air Force, Neville Duke. He later went on to break the airspeed record in the Hawker Hunter in the 1950s, or about 1951, I think. Let's have a look at some of the plastic kits at the back. Right in the centre, we've got a massive Tamiya 32nd scale Spitfire Mark 9, Johnny Johnson, Kenley wing. You can see his Canadian maple leaf just below the cockpit. So this would have been about 1943, so just a little bit after the Fighter Sweep. But this aircraft was introduced at the end of the Fighter Sweep period. Just above that is a 148 scale Hong Kong model Douglas Boston. Again, this is the typical aircraft that the Royal Air Force Spitfire Vs would be escorting on circuses. To the left and right of the Douglas Boston are two Spitfires, a Mark II on the right, flown by Wing Commander Douglas Bader, having his initial on the side of the aircraft, which was typical for wing leaders. This is Mark II ace, the early Fighter Sweep period, and Bader was lost, I think, in flying a Spitfire 5A in August 1941. To the left is a very early Spitfire Mark V, again, still retaining the early temperate land scheme of dark green, earth and sky. This comes with two fantastic markings for pilots. One is Eric Locke, and the other one is a NCO ace, one of the most famous of the flight sergeant aces, Donald E. Kingerby, the 109 specialist. In fact, these two aircraft, the markings for these two aircraft, I'll be doing the Spitfire Vs in Hobbymaster in the next few months. We've also got, just below the Spitfire Mark V early, a Edward Profi kit. This is a FW190, I think it's an A3. Again, it looks like to be given hard time to some Bostons. And then over the other side, just behind the Spitfire Mark V book, you'll find a 1/32nd scale Revel FW190 Butcherbird. We've also got there at the top left, a Hurricane 2C. That's a night fighter, but it comes with markings for aircraft used in the Dieppe raid and others on the Fighter Sweep raids. Across from that is a Tamiya Spitfire VB, a great first model of a Spitfire. If you want to do a 48 scale model of a Spitfire, I do recommend the Tamiya Superman Spitfire Mark VB. And above is a Mark 9 again from Italieri. The Tamiya Spitfire is quite pricey. It's around about £130. Douglas Boston around about £80. The two weekend Spitfire 2A and Spitfire 5B by Edward, their weekend are only about £20. They're super value. The Focke-Wulf down on the left is $29.99. The 136 scale Revell FW190, excellent value. It's only around about £34, something like that. So excellent models. So you can find all these models at www.tigerhobbies.co.uk. And remember, use the code YT10 for 10% off our excellent prices. So again, thank you for watching part 2 of Spitfire at 90 Focke-Wulf Summer. Thank you.